Welcome back, and now for the news in detail. In Afghanistan, 10 civilians have been killed and 6 wounded after the vehicle hit a roadside bomb in eastern Ghazni province. There was no claim of responsibility for the explosion. The explosion comes after the United States and Taliban paused Doha peace talks yesterday. Earlier this week, 2 people were killed in a Taliban suicide bombing near the largest US military base in Afghanistan. Last month, 15 civilians were killed when the vehicle hit a landmine in northern Kunduz province. Pakistan's Foreign Minister Shah Mahmood Qureshi said his country backs the peace process in Afghanistan. After meeting with the US envoy Zalmay Khalilzad in Islamabad, Qureshi said there is no military solution to the Afghan conflict. Khalilzad lauded Islamabad's support for the reconciliation process and shared details of the talks between the US and the Taliban. Khalilzad said he met Taliban leaders to express outrage over the attack on a US military base in Afghanistan. The US envoy also met Pakistan's Army Chief General Qamar Javed Bajwa in Rawalpindi. In a tweet, the military's media wing said the two discussed regional security and the Afghan peace process. The United Nations Human Rights Office has condemned India's Citizenship Act that grants nationality to only non-Muslim minorities. Speaking in Geneva, UN spokesman Jeremy Lawrence said the act is discriminatory in nature as it does not apply to Muslims. He said the legislation undermines India's secular constitution and called on the country's Supreme Court to review it. Japanese Prime Minister Shinzo Abe has cancelled his visit to India due to the violent protests against the law in Assam. Abe was scheduled to meet Prime Minister Narendra Modi in Guwahati next week. Police shot dead 3 people and wounded several others during clashes in the Muslim-majority state last night. In the UK general election, the Conservative Party has won a majority with over 360 seats. Britain's Prime Minister Boris Johnson says the electoral victory has ended the threat of a second Brexit referendum. Details in this report.
Britons have voted for the second time in 3 years to decide the government of their country. And once again, the Conservative Party has emerged as the largest party, but this time they won more seats than in the last election. The Tories' victory has finished any hopes of the UK not leaving the European Union. Johnson has repeated his wish to leave the EU with or without a deal.
With this mandate and this majority, we will at last be able to do what? You've been paying attention. Because this election means that getting Brexit done is now the irrefutable, irresistible, unarguable decision of the British people.
Meanwhile, European Council President Charles Michel said he hopes for a quick British parliamentary vote on Britain's withdrawal from the bloc.
I would like to congratulate the Prime Minister of the UK, Boris Johnson, with his victory, and we expect as soon as possible the vote by the British Parliament on the withdrawal agreement. It's important to have the clarity as soon as possible. We are ready. The European Union will negotiate in order to have a close cooperation in the future with the UK.
The Council President said the EU was ready to negotiate a free trade agreement with Britain, but called on London to work in good faith.
Moving on to Algeria, where former Prime Minister Abdelmadjid Tebboune has been elected a new president after a vote the authorities hope will end months of turmoil. But demonstrators who toppled his predecessor, Abdulaziz Bouteflika, vowed their movement would not stop. Protesters see the elections as an illegitimate sham intended to keep the old ruling elite in power. The Election Commission said Tebboune took 58% of the vote. The final voter turnout was 40%. The Commission said some 9 million Algerians took part in the election. The Libyan National Army head Khalifa Haftar has urged his forces to advance towards the center of Tripoli for a decisive battle. In a televised address, Haftar said the time has come for the broad and total assault expected by every Libyan. The LNA chief said the Libyan people have been looking forward to the advance. He said the operation will bring revolutionary changes to the country.
To all military units in the surroundings of the capital, Hour Zero has struck, the hour of the wide offensive which every honorable Libyan awaits. Our people in Tripoli have been looking forward to it ever so patiently, since they have been invaded by the terrorists.
Moving on to the US, where the US Senate has unanimously adopted a resolution that recognizes the Ottoman Turkish killings of Armenians during the First World War as genocide. Turkey has condemned the vote, saying it will not help improve relations between Washington and Ankara. The legislation's co-author, Senator Bob Menendez, said the Senate has corrected the history after passing the resolution. Meanwhile, Turkey's Foreign Minister Mevlut Çavuşoğlu called the vote a political show, saying it is not legally binding and has no validity. In a statement, Çavuşoğlu said the vote was a shameful example of how history can be politicized. The move has dealt another blow to the already difficult ties between Ankara and Washington. In the US, the House Judiciary Committee has postponed voting on articles of impeachment against President Donald Trump for a day. The move incensed Republicans, who said many had been planning to go home and would now have to reset their schedules. The decision was taken by Nadler after 2 days of acrimonious debate. Republican Doug Collins claimed the rescheduling was a publicity stunt. The two articles of impeachment accused Trump of abusing his power and obstructing Congress. Former Bolivian President Evo Morales has arrived in Argentina and has been granted refugee status. He had previously been in Mexico, where he was granted asylum after he resigned in November under pressure from the army. Argentine Foreign Minister Felipe Solá says Morales has come to stay. He said the government wants a commitment from Morales not to make political statements in Argentina. The former Bolivian president's arrival comes 2 days after new Argentine president Alberto Fernandez was sworn in. In Pakistan, 15 people have been killed after a passenger bus rammed into a truck in southwestern province of Balochistan. Rescue officials say the pickup truck was carrying containers of oil, causing the vehicles to combust upon collision. One person survived the collision by jumping from the passenger bus before the two collided. Police say initial reports suggest the accident took place due to overspeeding. More stories to follow, but right after a short break. Welcome back. The European Union has extended economic sanctions against Russia for another 6 months over its annexation of Crimea.
Spokesman for the President of the European Council, Barend Leitz, said the sanctions extension was decided by EU leaders after a meeting in Brussels. The sanctions were set to expire in January and will now be in place until the end of July 2020. The measures were first implemented in 2014. The move comes days after a Normandy summit in Paris between Ukraine, Russia, France, and Germany failed to find a breakthrough to solve the 5-year conflict. The restrictive sanctions target Russia's energy, financial, and arms sectors. The EU has said the measures will only be eased if Minsk's ceasefire deal signed by Moscow and Kiev in 2015 is fully implemented.
The EU has reached an agreement to work for carbon neutrality by 2025. EU leaders held talks in Brussels amid pressure to commit to making the 28-member bloc carbon neutral. After the meeting, European Council President Charles Michel said reaching carbon neutrality is an important goal. The deal left Poland out of the commitment and also allowed some members to use nuclear energy in the future. Earlier, Poland, Hungary and Czech Republic opposed the bloc's target of zero net carbon emissions. The 3 Eastern EU members argued move would hamper development of their coal-dependent economies. Wildlife on more than 750 Falkland Islands is under threat because of the growing problems of climate change. Environmentalists fear the local wildlife populations will fall if global temperatures rise by 1.5 degrees Celsius in the next 100 years. More about the threatened animals in this report.
About 1 million rock hoppers, gentoos, and Magellanic penguins, along with 25 species of whale and dolphins, call the Falkland Islands their home. Experts fear their numbers will drop if the climate emergency continues to affect their food sources. For example, tussock grass is a food source and shelter for many animals. This could be one casualty of rising temperatures, leaving soil vulnerable to erosion, something magnified by the Falklands' dry, windy climate.
So it's very vulnerable, and that's will only be found in tussock. And so if you have, once that goes, you lose the habitat for a whole load of species.
Changing sea temperatures have already affected the gento penguins. Falklands Conservation is involved in restoration projects. It is planting tussock in coastal areas on outlying islands.
They depend on the ocean for food, and as we see climate change changing our oceans, likely changing our currents, changing how our marine ecosystems work, we'd potentially be seeing changes in species and population numbers.
Rising sea levels due to melting ice caps will eventually cause serious problems for each of the world's islands, but the Falklands currently has more pressing concerns.
In Burkina Faso, the bars of the capital Ouagadougou play the music of the legendary Buena Vista Social Club, attracting crowds of 60 and 70-year-olds. The music's popularity in the city dates back to the time of President Thomas Sankara, who sought inspiration in Cuba's music and revolution. This report tells how the Cuban tunes traveled to West Africa.
In the bars of Burkina Faso, the music of Cuba's legendary Buena Vista Social Club is alive and thriving. Bob Seydoux and his band, the Faso Elites, play every weekend in one of the many bars and clubs of the capital Ouagadougou.
Us Burkinabe people like Cuban music. It takes us back to the old days, the time of our parents and our old president Thomas Sankara. May he rest in peace. He really liked Cuban tunes.
Thomas Sankara was nicknamed the African Che Guevara. He became a figurehead of the anti-imperialist and Pan-Africanist movements. Sankara led Burkina Faso from 1983, before he was betrayed and assassinated in 1987. At this time, when many African nations were moving on from decades of colonial rule, Cuban music, with its links to the revolutionary politics of Fidel Castro, struck a chord. During Sankara's time in office, many people went to Cuba for education. In exchange, many Cubans travelled to Burkina Faso, political advisors, soldiers, doctors, and musicians too.
Cuba was a revolutionary country. At the time, there was a partnership between Burkina and Cuba. There were Cubans who came over bringing Cuban groups with them, like the Orquesta Aragon. They came here.
Thomas Sankara was a musician himself, playing in guitarist Roger Bihun's former group Missile Orchestra before his ascent to the presidency. Together, they made music halls and bars sway to their Afro-Cuban rhythms.
The tunes we played with him were written by Jonas Pedro and others. There were some Cuban pieces that we wrote here, mixing it in. We were good at Congolese music, Cuban, Mandinka, and Guinean tunes.
The country recently observed the 32nd anniversary of Thomas Sankara's death and remembered this music-loving leader, a figure from a time when the worlds of music and politics were more intertwined than ever.
The Pakistan Stock Exchange touches 10-month high as the KSE 100 index crossed 41,000 level with an increase of over 500 points. PSX has become the top performing stock exchanges in the world. From July to December, it has given a nearly 20% return, highest in the last 6 years. According to Bloomberg's World Equity Index rankings, the KSE 100 index became the 6th best performing market since July. It provided returns of over 8% on investment. Credit rating agency Moodys slashes India's GDP forecast to 5.6%, lower than 7.4% growth in 2018. Moodys said it lowered India's 2019 GDP growth forecast as slow employment growth weighs on consumption. It noted India's economic growth has decelerated since mid-2018. Last month, Moodys downgraded India's ratings to negative from stable amid economic and institutional weaknesses. Stock markets across Europe are trading higher amid speculation that the US and China are close to reach a trade deal. Investors are upbeat as UK's ruling Conservative Party has won a majority in the general election. London's FTSE 100 is trading nearly 1.5% higher as Virgin Money UK stocks surged over 16%. Frankfurt's DAX and CAC 40 in Paris gained over 1%. In Asia, the gains were led by Tokyo's Nikkei 225, closing over 2.5% shares of index. Meanwhile, international Brent crude oil prices have surged nearly 1% ahead of trade deal hopes. Another weather situation from around the globe. And that's all for now. For the latest updates, you can follow us on social media at Indus.News.